The photograph is small enough to disappear inside a book, the kind of print you could lose between chapters and never notice until years later. Sepia has thickened with age, and the corners are soft with handling, as if too many thumbs once held it up to the light. A narrow street in Whitechapel stretches away from the lens, wet cobbles catching a weak glow, brickwork darkened by coal smoke and hard winters. If you're watching this alone, late or quietly, stay with me. And when it feels right, subscribe and comment with what you notice first. The smallest observation is often the one that opens the door. The photo surfaced the way most real mysteries do, without ceremony. A battered envelope in a job lot at a Shoreditch house clearance, a penciled caption on the back, Whitechapel, 1890, and a faint oval stamp from a long-gone stationer. The seller didn't offer a story, just a shrug and a price. But the buyer did what careful people always do with careful things. They didn't rush to believe it. They scanned it at high resolution, flattened the creases as gently as possible, and stared until their eyes started inventing patterns in the grain. At first glance, everything behaves. The street is too tight for carriages to pass comfortably. The shop fronts are heavy with ironwork and grime. A horse-drawn cart sits mid-frame, softened by a slow exposure, as though time itself moved while the shutter stayed open. Figures linger near a corner, flat caps, long skirts, shawls pulled tight, faces smeared into anonymity by the camera's patience. Gaslight, not electric glare, seems to be the logic of the scene. Even the weather feels honest, that particular London damp that doesn't fall so much as settle. And then, once you see it, you can't unsee it. On the right-hand wall, just above head height near a shop front, there's a rectangular metal box. Not a wooden notice board, not a soot-stained placard, a clean-edged, industrial-looking junction box with a conduit pipe that disappears into the brickwork like a vein. It's the kind of practical hardware you expect to find once streets have been opened up, once wiring has become ordinary, once the city has accepted the hum of electricity as background. But this image is labeled 1890, an era that still trusted gas to light the night, and still treated much of Whitechapel as an afterthought in the grand plans of London. A single object shouldn't feel like an accusation, yet it does, because it doesn't merely look odd, it looks purposeful, installed, fitted, meant to be there, and that creates a question that has weight. If the box belongs to a later street, then what else in this photograph has been slid out of its proper year? The first person brought in is a photo conservator, someone who doesn't chase romance, only process, paper stock, chemistry, the way silver gelatin prints age compared to albumin, under angled light. The surface tells stories your eyes miss. Minute cracking, the sheen of old coatings, the scuffed places where the image has been kissed by skin oils over decades. The conservator's first caution is simple and brutal. Captions lie. They lie by mistake, they lie by assumption, and sometimes they lie because a better story sells. So the second person is a local historian, the kind who reads city records the way other people read novels. They don't start with the box. They start with the street itself. Whitechapel changed names, shifted boundaries, swallowed lanes into broader roads as planners tried to improve what they considered unruly. The historian points to the shop signs, half legible in the blur, and the angle of the brickwork at the corner. They circle the gas lamp style. They compare the cart's wheel design to catalog images. They do what you do when you're trying to date a moment. You build a case from a dozen small certainties because one big certainty is rarely safe, but the junction box keeps pulsing at the edge of every conclusion. A third participant enters quietly, an archivist at a London collection who recognizes the faint oval stamp on the back. Not a famous institution, something smaller, a commercial stamp used for processing or resale. The archivist has seen that stamp paired with images that were reprinted years after they were taken, sometimes from older negatives, sometimes from later copies. In other words, the photograph in your hand can be younger than the scene it depicts, and the caption can be younger than both. That should calm things down. It should turn the mystery into a clerical shrug. Instead, it sharpens it. Because when the scan is enlarged again, when the right-hand wall is examined like a crime scene, The conduit line looks too integrated. The mortar around it seems disturbed in a way that suggests installation, not a scratch on the print. And if it's truly part of the captured street, then we are no longer arguing about mislabeled paper. We're arguing about the street's timeline, about redevelopment arriving earlier than remembered, about the kind of quiet municipal work that happens at night, then gets written into records later if it gets written at all. And that leads to the first real tremor, a note from the buyer, almost casual, almost reluctant. In the envelope with the photograph was a second scrap of paper, thin, torn, with a date range scribbled in a different hand. Not 1890, something later, only partially legible, as if someone didn't want to be too clear. Now the question isn't just what is that box, it's why did someone need this to be 1890? If you felt that small tightening in your chest, the sense that the past is being rearranged in front of you, leave this with me in the simplest way. Like, subscribe, and comment what you think the box really is before we let anyone else tell us what we're supposed to see. The conservator's next step is unromantic. Measure, compare, exclude. Under magnification, the paper fibers show a uniformity that suggests a later commercial stock, not the more irregular feel you often see in truly early prints. The emulsion sheen, how it catches light when you tilt it, looks closer to a reprint than an original contact print. None of this proves fraud. It proves distance. A scene can be old while the object you're holding is younger than it claims. So the historian shifts the question. Not is the photo from 1890, but is the street from 1890? They start stripping the image for clues like a watchmaker taking apart a broken clock. The gas lamp is examined first. Its bracket style, the curve of the arm, the way the lamp sits against the brick. A catalog in the archive shows similar fittings used into the 1890s and beyond. Helpful, but not decisive. Then the cart, iron-rimmed wheels, the particular thickness of the spokes, the height of the bed, again plausible for 1890, but also plausible for later in poorer districts where old equipment lingered long after the city upgraded elsewhere. Clothing gives the first apparent anchor. One woman's skirt line, the drape, the heavy fabric, a man's cap and collar. The shawl pulled close to the throat. An expert in period dress is shown the scan without the caption. Their verdict lands in an irritatingly careful range. Late Victorian into the early Edwardian overlap, depending on class and circumstance. In other words, Whitechapel complicates everything. People there wore what they could get, not what fashion magazines declared. And then the junction box returns, stubborn as a bruise. A retired electrical engineer, someone who worked with municipal installations, notes the box's geometry. It isn't ornate. It isn't improvised. It looks standardized, like something ordered in batches. The conduit is the real tell. It runs with deliberate straightness, then makes a clean turn into the masonry. That kind of routing usually appears when a city starts thinking in systems, wires planned, not simply added. But Whitechapel in 1890 was not a place anyone hurried to modernize. So we chase paperwork. The archivist pulls street improvement reports, tender notices, and council minutes. A line appears about works in the wider East End, repaving, drainage, lamp maintenance, but nothing that screams electricity on that specific stretch. The absence feels meaningful until it doesn't. Records for minor works were often bundled, vague, or lost, especially in districts considered temporary, problematic, or simply poor. A new theory blooms, tempting because it's tidy. The box is not electrical at all. Perhaps it's a telegraph junction, or a police call point component, or even a photographic defect, an abrasion that resembles hardware. The conservator tests that last idea quickly. Under raking light, surface damage has a different character than photographed objects. Scratches interrupt the image. This box sits inside it. The shadows obey the street's logic. The conduit casts a thin line of darkness that matches the light direction. So we try geography. The historian overlays the visible roof lines and corner angles against old maps, then modern street plans. If the photo is truly Whitechapel, the perspective should match a junction that still exists in some form. For a moment, it seems to click, a corner that resembles a known lane near a market approach. Excitement rises until it collapses. The building proportions don't match. The window spacing is wrong. The curve of the road refuses to align. That's the first real dead end, and it changes the mood in the room. Because if the location is wrong, then Whitechapel, 1890 isn't merely a sloppy date. It's an identity the photo was given. The archivist returns to the oval stamp and finds it in a ledger fragment, a processing mark used by a small London dealer who bought old negatives and resold prints to tourists and collectors. The dealer's habit, noted in correspondence, was to label scenes with names that would move product, districts already infamous, streets already whispered about. Whitechapel had a marketable chill. A photograph attached to it became more valuable, more immediate, more charged. But the box still isn't explained by marketing alone, because another detail quietly surfaces in the scan. A faint line of patched brick around where the conduit meets the wall, as if the masonry was disturbed and then repointed. That suggests timing, work done, then smoothed over. Not a trick of captioning. A physical change. And suddenly the impossible object begins to look less like an anachronism and more like a clue to a specific moment. A street on the edge of transition, where one technology hasn't fully replaced another, where upgrades arrive in pieces, where neighborhoods get experiments before they get care. If you've been keeping your own private theory, hold on to it. And when you're ready, like, subscribe, and comment with the most ordinary explanation you can live with, because the truth in these photographs is usually plain and still hard to swallow. By the third week, the photograph stops being an image and becomes a location you can't stop walking through in your head. You start to know where the puddles sit. You start to feel the squeeze of the buildings, the way the street narrows like it's trying to hide. And that little box on the right wall, so neat, so certain, starts to feel less like a mistake and more like a decision someone made. The historian takes the case to someone who knows London's wires the way priests know a parish. A researcher who specializes in early municipal services, lighting, alarms, street works, the quiet infrastructure that rarely makes it into memoirs. They don't argue about fashion or carts. They ask one blunt question: if this is an electrical fitting, what kind? They point out something nobody wanted to admit. The box isn't positioned for a household. It's too high, too exposed, too public. Whatever it served the street. That narrows the possibilities. Power to a lamp, a link in a low-voltage alarm circuit, a connection point for telephone or telegraph lines that have been routed in an unusually tidy way. It isn't proof of a glowing, modern Whitechapel. It's proof of a system being tested, patched in, and hidden as soon as it worked. That's when the investigation stops circling the photo and starts circling the borough. Whitechapel at the end of the century wasn't just crowded, it was politically inconvenient. Lodging houses swelling, sweatshops multiplying behind shopfronts, inspectors writing reports that sounded like moral judgment. There are council minutes filled with polite phrases, improvements, clearance, sanitation, words that meant someone would lose their room before they ever gained a streetlight. Policing thickened too, not just for crime, but for control, keeping markets moving, keeping crowds from gathering, keeping the poor from spilling into the wrong hours of the night. So the archivist digs differently, not for the photograph, for the kind of paper trail a photograph might have served. In a stack of municipal correspondence, they find repeated references to temporary works and trial installations around the East End. Things contracted out, itemized vaguely, filed without drama. A line about wiring connected to night supervision. A mention of a bell circuit for a row of workshops. Nothing that names the street. But the language is familiar. The city trying to solve a problem without admitting what the problem is. Then comes the contradiction that makes everyone sit up. The same year range that appears in those files, late 1890s into the early 1900s, matches the faint scrap of paper found in the envelope. That torn note suddenly looks less like clutter and more like a warning. Not 1890. Not even close. A local witness enters through the side door of the story, the way they always do. Not with certainty, but with texture. An elderly man recorded in an oral history project, his voice preserved on tape decades later, talks about a lane where they ran wires along the wall when the council started marking buildings for changes. He doesn't call it electricity with any pride. He calls it the new fuss. He remembers men in caps with clipboards, chalk marks on brick, and families shifting their belongings because someone said the rooms weren't fit anymore. It's frustrating testimony. Soft around the edges, hard to pin down. Until the photo is scanned again and the right wall is treated like a document. A technician runs contrast enhancement and edge detection, not to invent details, but to separate ink from grain. The conduit line brightens. The patched mortar becomes more obvious. And just beneath the junction box, almost swallowed by grime, a faint stenciled marking begins to appear. 2 short lines of block letters, the kind an inspector would slap onto a wall without romance. Not a shop sign. Not decoration. A bureaucratic bruise. The historian recognizes the format before the letters are even fully legible. Inspection codes, clearance marks, the kind used to identify buildings in reports and demolition schedules. The photo isn't a casual street scene anymore. It's evidence. A street captured not because it was beautiful, but because it was being processed, measured, judged, prepared to be changed. And now the junction box makes a crueler kind of sense. If the building was under inspection, if the street was under improvement, then temporary wiring isn't a luxury, it's a tool. A bell circuit for night watchmen, a connection for a new light outside a monitored doorway, a way to run a system without committing to rebuilding everything properly. Infrastructure that arrives like a bandage, not like care. On the blurred shopfront near the corner, a smear of paint resolves, just enough to read Bell before the rest dissolves back into the fog of the exposure. Not electric light company, not a modern brand, just a word that suggests ringing, signaling, summoning. The street wasn't ahead of its time. It was being managed. And that changes the central fear. The fear isn't that history is impossible. The fear is that it's ordinary. The city did things here first because it could, because the people living behind those bricks had the least power to object and the least chance of being believed later. If that landed in you the way it landed in us, stay close. Like, subscribe, and comment with the one detail you think the camera never meant to capture, because sometimes the truth is the part that wasn't posed. The last piece doesn't arrive as a dramatic confession. It arrives as a ledger entry with the warmth drained out of it. The archivist, stubborn now, requests the dealer's surviving paperwork, the kind nobody reads unless they're trying to prove a lie. In a thin bundle of accounts, there's a repeated pattern. Old negatives purchased in lots, prints made years later, captions added to suit demand. Whitechapel appears again and again like a hook. So does 1890. Not because the dealer cared about accuracy, but because those numbers sold a mood. Late Victorian London, narrow streets, danger implied without being named. Then one line breaks the rhythm. A note beside a batch of prints. Lane off commercial RD, inspection series, watch bell. Not poetry, not legend, a simple description of function. And suddenly the junction box stops being impossible. Watch bell wasn't a metaphor. In parts of London, especially where lodging houses and workshops ran late and fires spread fast, temporary bell circuits were used to alert a watchman or summon help, cheap signaling systems that could be mounted fast and removed fast. Sometimes they were connected to monitored lamps, sometimes to a call point, sometimes to nothing more glamorous than a bell in a back room where a man was paid to stay awake. The street didn't leap into the future. It was fitted with a tool meant to manage risk in a place the city considered expendable. The historian goes back through the municipal language with that phrase in mind and finds what was invisible before, the way officials talked about people as hazards, overcrowding, unsanitary, unfit. The wording wasn't only about health, it was permission. Once a building was unfit, it could be entered, measured, marked, cleared. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, but the process began with a chalk coat on brick and ended with families folded into some other corner of the city. That faint stenciled marking beneath the box, the one the technician pulled from the grain, becomes the emotional hinge. It's not a ghost. It's a tag. The kind of mark that tells you the street is being handled by the machine of improvement. And that's why the photograph exists in the first place. It isn't a tourist's souvenir. It isn't a casual street portrait. It's a record, either for an inspector's file or for a contractor's proof that work was done. The junction box was installed because someone wanted a bell to ring when something went wrong. Fire, crowd, collapse, a door that shouldn't open, a workshop that shouldn't keep running after midnight, a system meant to control a neighborhood, not uplift it. The mislabeled caption comes last, like insult added to injury. Years later, the dealer reprints the image, scrubs away its administrative purpose with a romantic date, and sells it as 1890 Whitechapel, a piece of darkness you can own without inheriting responsibility. The past becomes a costume. The people in the frame become props. There's an epilogue detail that doesn't solve anything, but it stays with you. In the far left edge of the scan, barely inside the border, a child stands half cut off by the photographer's composition. Only the outline of a coat, the suggestion of small hands, the head turned away. Not posed, not acknowledged, just present. If this was an inspection street, if this was a clearance lane, then that child isn't atmosphere. That child is the cost. We can name the object now. A junction box for a temporary bell circuit. Street-level infrastructure used for night supervision during inspections and impending works, likely installed in the late 1890s or early 1900s. We can explain why it looks too modern inside a scene that still wears gaslight and old clothes. Technology doesn't arrive evenly, and it arrives first where officials need leverage. We can also explain the lie on the back of the print, a dealer repackaging bureaucracy into myth. What we can't do is restore the lives that were pushed out of those rooms, or trace every face blurred by the slow shutter. The photograph gives us a mechanism, not a mercy. It shows how a neighborhood can be managed, marked, and sold, first by the city, then by commerce, then by memory itself. If you felt something in that, something heavier than the box on the wall, like subscribe and comment with the one person in the photograph you can't stop thinking about, sometimes that's how we keep them from disappearing twice.